Hold on. Now it's not connecting the right way. So hold on. Technical error. All right. Let me the stream, which is there it goes. Okay. Now I'm going to go live. Cool. Hello and welcome to yet another Tattered Cover virtual event. For those who don't know, Tattered Cover is an independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We have been open for 51 years now. We made it over half a century, and it's thanks to readers like you and authors like our guests tonight. Tonight we have R.R. Virdi, whose new book, Last Binding, is out now. Is it your debut book, Ronnie?
No,
No.
it's for traditional debut, but the first binding is my
First binding.
11th novel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry. First in a trilogy, I believe. I'm messing a lot up in this introduction.
No, you're fine. No. Yeah, but Tor bought three of the books,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm really excited. In conversation with Tim tonight is one of Tattered Cover's book buyers and author, Josh Clark. Before I turn it over to them, I do want to let everyone know that if you need or want closed captioning, it is at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says CC. You can go ahead and click that. It'll have closed captioning for you. But like I said, tonight we're here to celebrate our Verdi's book, The First Binding, in conversation with Joshua Clark. Please, Josh, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Adam. All right. So how are you doing, Ronnie?
I'm doing pretty good. Like we were talking earlier before we went on live, like just pretty tired. I've been traveling since about the end of June 28th, and I've done Denver, San Diego, back and forth here, New Orleans, back here, and then Dragon Con. So it's been, a busy time.
No, quite a busy schedule. So no, I wanted to ask, just with bringing that up, since seems you've regularly for a while now hit a bunch of the different cons, conventions, and just curious kind of what your favorite part about that atmosphere and environment is, and just what you enjoy most with those.
I like meeting people like outside of the professional part of it. Like paneling is fun. My favorite place to panel historically has been Dragon Con, because they were one of the first ones to invite me as a guest, and I get to teach, and I love giving back, especially to aspiring readers in the audience, because conventions is where I learned a lot of stuff for me from writing. But past that, I love bumping into readers and just nerding out like in the bar scene, or just walking around more than anything. Because at the end of the day, we're all nerds. That's why we're in this industry, and then why we all go to conventions. And it's just fun to celebrate being nerds, like whatever people want to talk about, that their cosplay, TV shows that we're all watching right now, books we're reading, or just video games, whatever. Like I go there because I'm an extrovert. I'd be going to conventions in most cases, even without the author stuff. And I just want to be around other nerds and have fun.
Yeah, no, and I agree. That's one of my favorite parts of that too. It's just we're all there to have a fun time. And like you said, it's nice. Yes, if you're networking, or there's the business element of it too. But yeah, I think as a whole, there is really just that fun sense of community. And and that's how you and I had bumped into each other in 2021 at Denver Denver Fan Expo. So opportunities like that, it's just a lot of fun. Cool. So guess I wanted to ask, just kind of before we got into the first binding, I know you had been self-published before that and have put out a number of books. And so guess just wanted to ask kind of what you got you writing in the first place, and then kind of your trajectory with some of those novels.
So I started summer before I started college. So like 2008, I was 18, just graduated high school, and I was going through some really hard stuff that summer and in my life. And it got to a pretty dark place. But after I recovered from that, my best friend and I were reading a book together at the same time. And the author had made a decision that kind of shocked us both. And we, in that one moment of like youthful arrogance, were like, that's not how you write a book. Like we could do it better. So we should write our own fantasy novel. And we just started writing one day together. Like he was sitting over my shoulder. This was back at like my parents' place, and we were using their computer because I didn't even have a laptop at this point. And I just started churning it out, and I instantly fell in love with it. The process, us talking about the ideas and just coming up with it and running with it, and it just felt like it was the most natural thing for me to do. Up until that point, the other aspiration I had was acting, and I did pursue that a bit. And there were other things that came up that kind of prevented me from following that. But writing was the one thing I was always able to keep doing, no matter what got in the way. And I've shared this story publicly, but about 2011, it was when a Ghost Story had just come up from Jim Butcher. I got to another low point again. And I met him at a signing and we had a conversation, and he was the one who motivated me to keep going and telling me that if I kept writing, kept doing everything I was doing, that one day I might get to where he's at. Like I'd be published, I'd be in an anthology maybe with him, or I would be on an award panel or like an award ballot with him, or a finalist for something, and all these things. And that gave me the courage to keep going with it. And I wrote my next urban fantasy novel over the next few years, The Grave Beginnings, which I published like Christmas week of 2013. When the novel started doing like okay, like it was finding its feet slowly, and I kept writing the urban fantasy genre because it's my passion, like favorite genre, and it started taking off slowly, like but like steadily. And I started saying like, oh, this is like becoming something now. In 2016, Grave Measures, the second novel, was up for the Dragon Award as a finalist for Best Paranormal Fantasy Novel that year, alongside with Jim Butcher. He had The Aeronauts Windlass, the first of the Cinder Spires books out that year. And I think Brandon had a title, and N.K. Jemisin was up for the ballot and stuff. And it was like fantastic. And it made me feel more, I guess, not just validated, but like that everything that Jim said, it's like, you could be up for an award with me one day. And I was like, oh, wow, like that happened now. Like maybe the other things will happen. And that just kept me going to where I just kept self-publishing novels, just writing the books I wanted to write, which then got to this point where we did this novel. And that did not become self-published, obviously.
Oh, no, that's fantastic and awesome to hear that process there, and that inspiration from Jim. And I've attended several of his panels before, and he kind of just has that way of, or at least it felt for me, just you're the only one in the room and he's talking right at you as kind of a writer of, I don't know, just very encouraging. And he's had a few things that have really stuck with me over the years. So I just wanted to ask also, your process with those novels, what kind of did that process teach you or help with this traditional transition?
Somewhat, and in other ways I think it was a hindrance. Like the writing craft stuff definitely was obviously practice, because I've been treating it like a job almost ever since I started. So being able to write books this big would have otherwise been daunting, and I wouldn't be able to do them. They're still taxing, but I'm doing them at a 1-a-year schedule right now, which is nuts for books that are 350,000 words and up. Nobody else has a deadline of doing a book that big right now in the industry that I'm aware of for 1 a year. It is hard. It takes a lot of time out of my day, but that helped with that. But the expectations going into traditional were very different. I'm used to a faster like book publication timeline after the draft's done, getting it out to my freelance editors on time, getting it back within a certain expectation, while I'm also talking to my cover artist and I have control to design that. Having a pre-order campaign set up, having early access beta readers through like my mailing list and stuff. And it's a really streamlined process, and I can get a book out pretty fast after I finished it, as long as I give the other creatives I work with on the freelancer teams like notice, like, hey, the book's going to be done by this time. I need, what's your editing schedules look like? And then there's also no contractual obligations. I can take a break and move to another project and do stuff. And there's a lot of legal stuff with traditional publishing. Like, you have non-compete stuff at times. You have, I turned in the draft for this book. Oh man, the beginning of 2021. And from that point, it took more than another year just to get it out. I mean, it came out in August, like middle of August this year. And if I had finished an indie book in 2021, I would have already had an editor ready, lined up for it. And I would have had developmental edits maybe back in a month. and I'd go through them in 2 weeks nonstop, and then it would go out to line and copy edits, and I would get that back, and then it would go to like a proofing team, and it would be going to betas at the same time for their structural feedback, and I could have that book out maybe 6 months later to my schedule. I mean, other indies can do it way faster, but I mean, there's still a faster turnaround, and that was something new to learn. And then obviously not having the market data, being traditional, you don't get to see a lot of analytics and stuff that I'm assuming that all the marketing people do. And as an indie, you get that. So that was very weird and different for me, not being able to track how am I doing, what am I doing, what could I be doing better, what platforms should I be trying to do stuff on. And there's a lot of hands-offness, which is fine. And a lot of people like that for traditional. But if you start indie, it can take some getting used to not having that level of insight and control and understanding how your book's performing where and what you can do to like make it do better.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I guess was the first binding then, had you had the plans of writing an epic fantasy in the works for a while, or what kind of made you decide to make that jump, I guess, from urban fantasy, since I know you've done a lot of that?
Yeah. So. I had something that was more like a colonization story that was fantasy, I guess, analogous. It's not contemporary. It's not traditional epic fantasy. It was somewhere in between. And it was a standalone idea. And I loved it. And that's what I was working on drafting. And when I was just tinkering with ideas, the storyteller who became Ari came up as a side character. And it was just a fun piece. And I was like, oh, I'll write this as a passion project for Patreon. It's going to be completely slow burn romance and lyrical, and it will be this frame narrative picaresque that I want to tackle. I can do South Asian mythology through it, and do my thing about comparative mythology, because there's a whole history of how the most famous myths and stories keep borrowing from each other and re-evolving. And I've tweeted a lot about this stuff. Like there's famous stuff about the analogs between Achilles and the Indian hero Karna, who both of them are famous for. Achilles had impregnable skin. It was impenetrable except for one spot that his mother overlooked. Karna had impenetrable armor. Both of them are famous warriors who are also demigods. And before they go off to war, both of their mothers, who are kind of witch queen sorceresses, are like, please don't go to war. And they beg them not to. And they both have very, very similar stories. And this is also followed by like the Indian storm god Indra, who fights Vitra, which is very similar to Thor fighting Jormungandr. And Joseph Campbell's done all this stuff with the comparative mythology and the hero's journey. And so this was like a passion nerd project for me to do self-published, actually. It was going to be on Patreon. And it just kept evolving. And then people at Audible and Tantor were interested. Like, hey, if you do this, we might buy the audio rights. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I bumped into who would become my tour editor, Christopher Morgan, later that year. And we had like a very tired kind of like morning breakfast at a convention when everyone else was like hungover and tired. And it was like a Sunday morning. And it was like one of those peaceful, quiet moments of breakfast where everyone's too tired from the convention, but you're still happy the convention's going on.
Sure.
And we just started nerding out and talking about what we like. And we talked about Wheel of Time and mythology and history and other classic fantasy books. And a fantasy series of mine that's completely like underrated that people don't know about that I really love is I think it's called The Chronicles of Sayala. I remember the first book is called Shadow Prowler, and it's by a Russian author, Alexei Pihov. And he actually heard of the series, and it's a tour series, but it never really blew up. And he loved it. So we hit it off, and he's like, yeah, send me this project you're working on. And I do. And I hear back from like a month or something later, and he's like, hey, do you have an agent? And I was like, no. Why? He's like, you should go get one because Tor wants to buy the series from you. I was like, oh, okay. And I had already been talking to Joshua Bilmish or Baums. I never heard his last name said aloud, so I'm apologizing. Joshua sees this. And he represents Brandon Sanderson and Charlene Harris and stuff. And one of the things he told me was he was one of the people who could get a series this big published because he publishes Stormlight. So I was like, hey, Joshua, Tor came back and they said they want to buy this. Do you want to represent me? And he called them up and confirmed everything. And then a few weeks later, or pretty soon, like around Christmas Eve or something, I had a contract for his representation. And then we just took it off there. And a few months later, beginning of 2020, Tor's gotten the contract to me. We signed it. And then a few months later, my UK agent, Stevie Finnegan, helped get Golanx, my UK publisher, on board. And it just went from there.
Wow, no, that's awesome process. So, yeah. Very neat. So I guess as we're kind of moving in, talking a little bit about the first binding, I guess for anyone who hasn't read it or isn't familiar, what's kind of just a quick pitch for it?
So it's kind of like if you've ever seen the idea of like the most interesting man in the world, those commercials we all saw like in the like 2010 to 2016 about the guy who it's like he's ridden a shark and he's like gone scuba diving like without any gear to 1,000 feet and he's lived this crazy life. I want to tackle that with the idea of like Forrest Gump and the whole frame narrative that they use about how you can have a larger than life character, but nobody knows the truth of his story except for him. And he gets to tell it to you because not everything is the way you think it is. And it's how mythology and storytelling have worked along the Silk Road through a lot of old history, where tales have been traded over and over, and people take the best parts that they like from others and they reinvent them or they readopt them to their culture. And they add their own pieces. And the mythology's on this too, like I was talking earlier, comparative mythology. So writing this story was kind of a way for me to do this and show like how does a legend of a legendary hero evolve, but also like where are the lies and truths of all that, and the audience gets to get in on the ride of seeing that. Like where do you separate the man from the myth and how it all comes to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's great, and I guess I had really enjoyed that reading through it. You could just every page and
thank you.
Kind of just filled with that love of storytelling, and could just really felt like a love letter to storytelling. And,
yeah.
Just loved that emphasis, and it reminded me a lot. I guess sort of around the same time I had been listening to a lecture Neil Gaiman did on just kind of the how stories last, and it was just really fun, I guess, encountering both of those, your novel and his talk at the same time, because they were just really playing off of one another. And
and there's a lot of that in my book. I'm not subtle about it. I make lines about how stories inspire each other. Other myths that I'm going to be tackling, because like I said, Joseph Campbell talked about in The Hero's Journey, but the most famous novels historically have taken so many beats in certain orders from famous mythologies, but myths have done it too. Like we talked about Achilles with the impregnable skin, but then there's also the Norse hero Siegfried, who kills a dragon and he bathes in dragon blood, and he gets impregnable skin through the dragon's blood, except for one spot where an oak leaf, or I think it's a maple leaf, covers his skin. So he's immortal, but for one spot, just like Achilles. And all these themes and almost similar events happen throughout history and time, and a lot of novels that use the hero's journey end up doing it in similar orders and similar beats. And part of my love letter to storytelling was showing that that a lot of legends inspire other legends, and then they eventually diverge more and more over time, but there's like this core root that they all sort of do early on. And that was my personal thing about, I was hoping to be able to show that with this, because I'm a huge nerd for just comparative storytelling and mythology, and like because I think that's one thing that unites us all as people. We all love stories, and we were all telling them around campfires, and people historically have like taken the stories they love and tried to make them their own or retold them and just shared them around the world, because mythology has done that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I wanted to ask, and you kind of touched on it a little, but with the framing story, was, I guess, there any challenges with, I guess, kind of jumping between those two storylines? Or
the way I wanted to do it was, I already knew I had an active plot in the present day, so I had to make sure that there's more time given to that, because there's not a lot of modern day examples, unfortunately, of frame narrative. A lot of them are more classic, and especially with picaresques as well, because a picaresque is kind of like a very slice of life story where you're following a hero, usually a rogue. It comes from the Spanish picario, so like Don Quixote is an example. And then you have stories like the Decameron. Obviously, I mentioned Forrest Gump, but I had to really go back and dig to older classical frame narrative stories. The Mahabharata, which is the Indian epic, it's I guess our version of the Odyssey, is historically a frame narrative, which is where I also went to. And there's a lot of present day plot, and figuring out how to balance that was the most challenging thing. Making sure I had enough time in the book to dedicate to Ari's past life and his legends, tying it back to something relevant enough in the present to give him motivation to have this story that's still continuing. Because I didn't want him to be sort of passive in the present day where he's just telling his story and you might have like a few scenes back to the present. But to me, as a storyteller, that almost makes the present kind of pointless in a lot of ways. I wanted there has to be some agency, at least for me, to enjoy it for the present day. And I had to come up with a separate, complete, larger storyline of something he still has to achieve and accomplish and make sure it's based off consequences or things he's done in his past story that eventually will tie back together as the series progresses.
Yeah, and I think you pulled that off wonderfully.
Thank you.
And yeah, no, it worked really well for me. And I guess just the whole pacing with that as well. And
Thank you.
I guess makes me kind of want to ask, like, just with how big a book it is, and just kind of the type of story it is, I guess, how, or I guess, were there some particular areas you needed to look at with the pacing, or kind of what did you use to drive that along to keep the momentum you carried through it?
Yeah, when I first wrote it, I was balancing two different kinds of pacing at the same time, because this is also a love letter to storytelling, and my character is an orator. He's a storyteller. That involved also about 2 years of working with a voice coach, because every line in this book was spoken aloud to a certain cadence that I did. Like if I was narrating it on stage, because that's how Ari would be performing it. This is meant to be orally pleasing for the ear by, oral technique. So very beginning of the book is very lyrically heavier than later parts, where I go a little bit harder on the prose, because he's performing and he literally tells the audience that the readers, there's that opening line where he talks about all the stillness of an audience waiting for a play to begin. From the moment he steps on, this is also a nod to theater culture, which I love, and I've got sort of a background in, where Ari sets it up as he's setting up a stage. This is literally enter Bard, on stage, set the scene, and go. And it's different pacing for when he starts telling the past story, which immediately falls into his sort of adoptive family. There's a lot more action and intrigue going on, and you're more attached to the character at this point in his past life. And he's trying to set up his personal ambitions and goals, and he's in a dangerous situation, so you empathize with him. Where in the beginning, he's kind of coming off as a more show-offy, because he's auditioning for a job, really. He's a foreigner in a foreign country trying to get a room for the night, and he has to pretty much go, 100% theater kid and audition for this job from the very second he steps to the door, because nobody knows who he is at first look, and he's a stranger in a strange country, and there's underlying tones of xenophobia because he's a foreigner. And I wanted to sort of tackle a slower pacing at the beginning and lull kind of readers into this, because it's supposed to be a performance and he's warming people up. And there are some lines that are a little bit more subtle about that, where if you read it and pay attention, you'll see that, oh, that's what he's doing. And then others where he's a little bit more overt, because he can have that conversation with other characters now or to the audience. But it was challenging for me because it's not my usual pacing. Coming from urban fantasy, I have way closer to a thriller and mystery pacing, which is way more faster intrigue, more suspense, more action. All the Grave Report books normally start with some kind of action sequence, or the mystery intrigue thing where it sets up a question that's intriguing enough that makes you really want to just dive into it. And this was counter to everything I've been writing for most of the last 10 years now.
Wow. Yeah. No, that is quite a change. So I guess it was a little bit ago you kind of touched on something I had wanted to ask. So I guess kind of just through the writing process with a book, kind of what's that element that pulls you through, or I guess kind of the carrot dangling in front of you to kind of keep you going, and especially with something like this that's got a lot of words to get through. So
I once heard it said, and I heard this from Jim Butcher, and it stuck with me because I believe it is, you don't have a muse, you have a mortgage. And I'm at the point in my career where I'm writing full time, but I'm not a #1 international bestseller, so I have to keep working. I'm at the working class writers thing, but I'm also doing what I love. So, but there are days, obviously, it gets hard, right? And I struggle with mental health stuff. I have really bad depression, and you can have days where it's just really agonizing. But I've sort of ritualized writing over the last 10 years, which has worked, and it's something a lot of people talk about. And I'm not criticizing people who write when they can, because this is a hard job. Not everyone gets to be able to do it every day. And nor should you. But for me, that's become the thing that helps, is making this kind of like going to the office every day. Because part of writing for me is I believe in the idea of flow state, where if you do it enough, it kind of becomes subconscious. A lot of athletes talk about that, where they get into a flow state and it's become repetitive and they understand the motions. And when you dedicate enough time to the craft, you can just get in the zone. So I've tried to turn as many things as I can into a ritual about getting into the zone. I have a certain computer I work at, which is where I'm at right now. Like, this is my office computer. It's set up a certain way. It's vertical monitors instead of horizontal, so I don't ever look away from something. I always have my manuscript in front of me, and I can have a research thing or something I'm looking at up top. And I always have something, so because I also have ADHD, if I look away, at least I'm looking at research. That's the immediate thing I can distract myself with, but it's usually relevant to something I'm doing. And then off screen, but right immediately to my left, I have corkboard strips with like index cards, because I'm not an outliner or a pantser, but I do jot down notes and plot beats or key points of story I want to go to. So they're always here. So no matter which way I turn, I've set up my immediate writing area to sort of help keep me steered towards writing. So I don't lose the incentive to want to write. Like, I do get joy out of it. It's my passion, but ADHD and depression want to take me out of that. But as long as I have enough key things to sort of keep me going, I can go like, okay, I'm here. I can put in the 2 to 3 hours to write 2,000 to 3,000 words today. And then when I'm done, I can go screw off and do other things, which usually ends up being more nerd stuff anyways for me. I'll read comics, I'll read something else, I'll take notes on mythology or whatever.
Cool. No, I think that's great, and I totally agree. Like, it really helps having, yes, either a setup or just something that gets you into that mindset or routine, and that helps a lot. So you kind of just touched on it, but guess I want to ask in a little further detail. What are those things that help fill up your creative well?
Okay. Yeah. One thing, I can't remember who said it, and I believe it was an artist or a writer. It was an artist of some stripe from like 1900s. And he talked about just living life. It's not just doing what you love, obviously, but like having other hobbies that even if you're not good at, it still gives you life experience. Like, a lot of the theater stuff of this book and our storytelling stuff comes from my love of actual theater. Like, I wanted to act, and I still do. I'm working on that in my personal life, trying to get back to that. And just, I have a love of stage theater, especially the craft that goes into it, the kind of lyricism, especially old theater, Shakespeare, poetry. I'm a huge poetry reader and writer. Music. I play guitar. I'm not exactly great at it, but I play and I fiddle around. Video games, which is another form of media and storytelling that I love. And I actually enjoy learning how video game writers craft their stories. I am a storycraft nerd at heart. I love understanding how people tell stories, how they came up with stuff, how they crafted a particular one. Like, one of the most recent things I did was study the recent God of War game, but how they created their mythology for that game, where they revolved it around the idea of what happens if you just take Loki out of mythology. And how does that change the Norse epics for when Loki's reintroduced now as Kratos' son, but he wasn't around to affect the greater myths at that time. So I thought that was really fascinating, because it's a great what if question, and they're working with mythology. But it taught me a lot as a writer of how just asking a certain question and learning how to reintroduce an aspect can completely change a universe, but keep it familiar. And I thought that was really fascinating. And it was a game of the year winner. And it was a learning lesson. It was also fun, and you get to play the game. So it feels like win-win.
Oh, that's really cool. Let's see. So I guess I kind of had a hypothetical type question, sort of, I don't know, just kind of a fun one I was curious with. So if you, I guess, could have any sort of merch made from the first binding or your world, what would be that piece of merch you'd like to see?
Weirdly, I think it'd be a candle line, because candles come in really thematically important in the books. And that has to do with a lot of stuff from my childhood too. So I meditate. And the first way I taught myself a lot of visualization and meditation was staring at a candle flame. And I remember seeing that and learning from that from a movie. And I found out later there's a lot of Asiatic practices about that. And it was a focus tool for some people, and a lot of cultures also symbolically, value the candle. But I think it was an early Shaw Brothers movie, and I don't know if it was this one. I got to be careful, but I think it was Return to the 36th Chamber of Shaolin, a martial arts movie. And they had like a scene with a candle in it, and the room was dark, and you were just focusing on the candle flame. And that's been imprinted in my mind forever, and I've used that as a personal visualization technique to focus on stuff. So a bit of me bleeding into this. And candles became mythologically very important then in this world, because my magic system is based on something numinous and tenuous, which is belief, which can be broken and changed and changes you, and it's not a static thing. So I needed a visualization thing for my character to focus on to help train his mind. And that was me coming in with that. And then candles just took off with the mythology as I was writing the nesting stories in the background. And I created a whole lineage of every binder has a candle. And I haven't shared why past the visualization technique is important to all the characters yet, if there are reasons for it. And I think a candle line would just work. And plus, as book nerds, right? Like, doesn't every book nerd love candles? So
I would agree. Yeah, no, this would be a great thing to pair with it. So I think it's really cool.
Sorry, hopping back in, I have some audience questions. Yeah, I do think all book nerds love candles, though. That's like a given.
Right.
Yeah, a few questions, and we have, I think, Dante J. Allen. I'm just going to read their YouTube name. Do you have any sort of software you use to organize your research? You mentioned like note cards, but are you in the 21st century?
No, I'm not, and I should be. I know a lot of people do. I am so, and this is weird because I'm like a huge tech geek, right? Like I'm an audiophile. I've got expensive headphones, and I have like a $6,000 gaming PC. Like I used to work in the, I was a blue collar guy because I never finished college, so I bummed around. I used to build custom gaming computers, and I've got a lot of tech, but I'm a hardware tech guy, not a software tech guy. So I still write on Microsoft Word 2000.
Okay.
So I don't even have a, because it's so like not distracting. There's like not a lot of stuff. It's just a white page. It doesn't even tell me my word count, which is great because I'll go past it way more often.
Nice.
But I am very analog, and it's bad because I have ADHD. I shouldn't be. I should be using software. I know of someone I would recommend. A lot of writers use Scrivener. One that I've been looking in for because it's digital note cards is Trello, which I believe is free, and you can create like a digital cork board and have all your index cards there and expand them. I do that analog where I have an index card, and behind it I have a folded loose leaf piece of paper with like an expanded idea of that, like whatever I jot down on the note, like, oh, I have a page idea for it now, and I'll just tack it to there and you pull it out and it just falls out and it's a full page. But no, I need to upgrade. I just can't. I just don't do it. I should.
It's whatever works.
Whatever works, right?
Yeah.
And another question, I'll have Josh, you answer it as well. What are you reading in the fantasy genre and the sci-fi genre? What are both of you reading? I know we talked about this before we recorded, but
so I make no secret of it. Very public. Jim Butcher is my favorite author. I just literally refinished Stormfront today, the first book of the Dresden Files, and I'm simultaneously reading it with City of Brass again by S.A. Chakraborty. And I'm also reading Flames of Mira by Clay Harmon right now. I got an arc earlier this year, but because of all the travel and work and burnout, I've just been super slow. But that's his debut fantasy from Rebellion Publishing that came out earlier this year.
Cool. Josh, how about you?
Yeah. I guess one I had recently liked was Blake Crouch's latest one, Upgrade. I really enjoy his blend of into pretty near day science fiction and a nice thriller pace. And I guess kind of along those same lines, I had just finished up the latest Denver Moon novella by Josh Viola and Warren Hammond from Hex Publishers in Denver. And yeah, it's a lot of fun kind of sci-fi set on Mars, with also a noir twist. So yeah.
Awesome. For people, actually, this is my own question. I'm going to hop in and ask my own because I get to do that on screen. What was like your first love in like the sci-fi fantasy genre? Like, what was the book that like turned you on to it?
Oh wow! I actually remember this. And I'm not counting horror because I was actually introduced to Goosebumps before.
Of course.
Sci-fi fantasy novels.
Yeah.
But the first novel books that actually got me into it was the Han Solo trilogy. I borrowed them from my library, and it was particularly the first one, which I actually made a point to go back, and I bought them recently in paperback when they reintroduced the Legends EU, because I think there was a point where it got like discontinued when the new Disney EU came out, and then they reintroduced them and they came back in paperback, and they're such a fundamental part of my childhood. It's very weird that I haven't written much sci-fi because I grew up more of a sci-fi reader first. I was reading everything in Star Wars, which I know people call space fantasy or space opera, but it was still sci-fi to me. And it got me into like Stargate Atlantis, and I was reading everything sci-fi, like all the Young Jedi Knights, everything, until I discovered urban fantasy and more traditional fantasy around like 10 years old, 11. But up until like 5 or 6, when I was reading, when I started reading a lot, it was all just Star Wars stuff. Because like I think they did that's when the theatrical re-release of original trilogy came back out. Like New Hope had just premiered again in 94, 95 in theaters again. And that's where I got to see it. And then Empire Strikes Back. And then I got to see the Star Wars books coming out. And it was like, oh, okay, this is like the coolest stuff ever. And I just devoured them.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's like before we were live, I mentioned how I read like just sad, depressing realism, but I once a month try to read like a Star Wars book, or like once every so often. And I used to say they were my palate cleanser, but because like they're fun, but like fun books are good books too, you know. Like I don't know.
Yes,
I'm trying to. Yes,
oh,
that's important.
The whole Litvic argument, right? Like fun books aren't good books, though.
And I think I was stuck in that for a very long time, and I'm open about that. How like of a stuck up jerk I was about how I talked about literature.
I had those creative writing teachers. It was not a. That's why I never stuck with a creative writing class, because I always had that. It's like if you're not writing like Dickens or Hemingway, you suck, and it's like, okay, wow,
yeah. I'm going to see if there's any more questions popping up. Okay. Oh, someone, Mark just wants to know, like, how would you describe urban fantasy? Like, they've never heard that term. What's urban fantasy all about?
Okay. So without referencing the actual novels, it's usually things that are fantastic and supernatural in nature, set in a city environment, hence the urban part of the name. A lot of times urban fantasy gets relegated to stories set today with those magical things, but it doesn't have to be. You can have an alternate city or timeline. I know someone who's writing of an alternate magical 1920s, and they don't have a real city, but it's very similar to New York. And then in it, you would have fairies and elves, magical supernatural creatures. If you do want a good example, Neverwhere, I think is one of the earlier, most popular urban fantasies. It was mid-90s before Dresden Files. Buffy technically counts as an urban fantasy because it was modern, set in a city town, and it was supernatural events happening in that time period. And it has overlap with contemporary, which is mostly magical stuff, but set today. Supernatural is a contemporary fantasy. It's set today, but they're not always in the city. They travel from town to town, solving monster threats. Supernatural stuff comes in gods, magic, rituals, witches, whatever. It's a broad genre that's continuing to be reinterpreted, which is something I love, because now a lot of POC and different authors are being able to write it with their takes and bring in different mythologies and cultures and different lenses and characters. So yeah, it's kind of a broad brush, which is why I loved it when I first got into it, because there was so much potential, and I think there still is for that genre to be explored.
Yeah. And then another question, and thank you for that, actually, because I think I have made it clear in this conversation that I don't know much about the sci-fi fantasy world. And like, I know what urban fantasy is because I work in the book industry, but like I did not before, Alan asks, or he says, the cover of your book, The First Binding, is so beautiful. And then he follows that great compliment up, and I agree with what other fantasy covers just do you love?
Oh, wow. So obviously I think Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight covers are absolutely gorgeous. They're probably the best fantasy covers I've seen for art style. And the funny story about The First Binding one is that's actually my indie artist. When I was first conceptualizing The First Binding, I hired someone to do sort of game board concept art. And we had gone through like 5 different versions of our own covers, and Tor saw that when they bought the book, and they're like, yo, can we just rehire him to redo the cover our way, which is mostly what I already did. And the original version, he just had a hood on, so you couldn't see his face, and they just took it off and gave him a face, and they changed it and made it look pretty. But other fantasy covers I really like. Wow, that one's hard right now off the top of my head because I'm doing so many ebooks, and I read on a black and white screen without a backlight, so it's easier to go to bed at night, and it kind of dulls it. But I actually have always liked the Game of Thrones symbol covers that they had. I don't know if they redid them when HBO first gave them the show, but they had like a gradient background with one just big symbol for like each book. Like the first one I think was the Iron Throne, the second one, which is a Clash of Kings, had like a crown, and then Storm of Swords just had like a helmet. But it was so visually striking at that time, and it was very different from the late 90s, early 2000s, where everything was a painted cover and everything was emulating the Wheel of Time style, where it looked like these guys who were just cosplaying at a Ren fair just gathered around like a random prop. And you're like, this is very confusing. Like, I don't understand what's happening. It looks like there's 3 teenagers hanging out. And that was different for me seeing that. I loved it. But the last one that sticks out, I think, it's an alternate edition, or it's a different country's editions of Peter Vrett's The Desert Spear, is it? And it was like this spear with this like hollow foil red background and sun, and it was just so striking and visually beautiful. It's hard because I know so many have come out this year, and like there were so many good ones too. Oh, probably Babel by R.F. Kuang.
No.
I don't know if I said her last name right. I've never heard it said aloud, so I apologize if I got it wrong. But she's had like so many different alternate editions of that, but just the normal edition of it is just beautiful. I thought that was a very striking, black and white cover, and it was really cool to see that done and be that contrasty and still pop.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely beautiful. We'll hopefully be having her in one of our stores in Denver for anyone listening soon. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but maybe. Keep an eye out for that. I will ask first. I want to ask Josh. Josh, you were recently published in an anthology. What's the anthology? Where can we find it? What's it called?
Yeah, so I guess I had one in Pikes Peak Writers called Fresh Starts, and then I have one coming out October 1st in Halloween anthology called Nom Nom. So yeah,
awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a little shout out. I think I mentioned this at the top of the hour. Joshua Clark is one of our book buyers at Tattered Cover and a published writer, so I want to give him a shout out. Ronnie, what are you working on next? We'll end on this. Is it the sequel to this, or are you doing something completely different?
So it's technically, I'm drafting stuff for book 3. Believe it or not, I already turned in book 2 this July, so before book 1 was released. I'd like to have book 3 turned in a month or two might be generous, a month at least before book 2 is published next year. It's going to be closer to fall. Right now I'm working on the 4th novel on The Grave Report, which is my indie urban fantasy series. And a short story from that debuted earlier this year. It's the first short story in Jim Butcher's anthology, Heroic Hearts. So that kind of got me the momentum to get back into my world, because I've been stuck in the Tales of Tremaine world for like many years now. And I like bouncing to keep fresh. So I'll be working on that. I'm currently adapting a serialized young adult contemporary fantasy, like a YA Alice in Wonderland that has to do with dreams and nightmares. Because for the last few years, I've been suffering from very vivid dreams that have made sleep not great. So I want to write about that. And it's about a young girl who has been bottling away her nightmares and selling them at a shop, but she doesn't have money. So to earn like good dreams to be able to sleep, she's sort of going into bad dreams and cleaning them up. It's like a dream janitorial story that I just wrote to process stuff, but I'm going to be adapting that into like a full-length novella now, and then hopefully publishing that for free. I just want to give that away to readers. It didn't take me time to do. I genuinely loved it, and it was just like a nice way, like a reader gift, if you will. And then I'm planning the first short story or novella in the Tales of Tremaine universe to also do something similar with this year. I'm hoping to have that done by winter and get that out. So for people who loved book 1 and read it, they'll have a short a side story that they can read that doesn't ruin the book for new readers, but for everyone who's read it, they can it takes place afterward, and they'll have a little fun story to celebrate and learn more about the world and Ari and what's going on between the events of where book 2 will start.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Josh, for doing the conversation, and then thanks our Virdi, the first binding out now, for joining Tattered Cover. If you missed any of this virtual event, you can rewatch it at your leisure as much as you want on the YouTube link. Thank you both. Oh, and I always forget to ask this, and I won't today. Where can we find you on the internet? What's the best way to connect with you?
So Facebook, whatever, like the link is like Facebook/RR Virdi or whatever. My author name, like I have an author page there and I'm pretty active. Twitter is where I'm most active. I've been getting better about Instagram. I do post a lot, and if people, comment on my stuff, I will comment back. I'm not really good with DMs on Instagram because I keep forgetting they exist and that there's another hidden inbox. I'm terrible with that. But Twitter, like I really am active on Twitter. I might get into TikTok depending on how many people keep irritating me to get on TikTok. I've been getting a lot of stuff to do that, and I'm just like, it's too much social media, but we'll see.
Yeah,
I might get on TikTok. I don't know how much of a masochist I am, but.
Well, thank you so much for joining Tattered Cover tonight, and everyone out there, stay safe. Have a great night.
Thank you guys for having me.
Cool.